Hi, that smells amazing.
Welcome, fresh jollof, best in the market.
I'll take one, please.
Right away.
Wow, it smells amazing.
It's our secret recipe. Want to taste?
Yes, please.
Here you go. This is incredible. I told you, the best.
You are right.
Enjoy. Here you are, madam, fresh and hot.
Oh, it smells wonderful. Thank you, as always. Enjoy. More coming up. Try my special stew, made fresh today.
It smells wonderful. Let me taste.
What do you think?
Delicious.
Chef Kato, I could smell your cooking from the path.
Welcome. You must try my stew.
It smells wonderful.
The smell of roasted spices drifted through the busy evening market, wrapping around the crowd like an invisible invitation. People stopped, turned their heads, and followed the scent until they reached a small wooden food stall at the corner. Pots simmered gently over open flames, and the sound of sizzling oil filled the air. In front of the stall stood a young woman named Amara, her eyes sparkling with excitement as she waited for her plate. Anyone who knew Amara knew one thing for sure: she loved food more than anything else in the world. Amara was what people proudly called a true foodie. She traveled from village to village, town to town, tasting every dish she could find. Spicy stews, sweet pastries, smoky grilled meats, rich soups. If it was food, Amara wanted to try it. She believed every recipe carried a story, every flavor held a memory. While others collected jewelry or clothes, Amara collected tastes and aromas. But on this particular evening, something was different. As the chef behind the stall lifted the lid off a large pot, a rich and mouth-watering aroma filled the air. The crowd leaned closer. The dish inside looked unlike anything Amara had seen before. Thick, golden stew bubbled slowly, filled with tender meat, colorful vegetables, and spices that seemed to glow in the steam rising from the pot. The chef stirred the stew calmly. His movements were slow, confident, almost mysterious. His name was Kofi, a quiet man known across nearby villages for cooking meals people never forgot. Some travelers said his food was magical. Others claimed he knew secret recipes passed down through generations. Amara watched him closely as he prepared a bowl and handed it to a customer. The moment the customer tasted it, their eyes widened with surprise. This is the best thing I've ever eaten," the man whispered. Amara felt her curiosity grow stronger. When it was finally her turn, Kofi placed a warm bowl in front of her. The steam rose gently, carrying a smell so rich it made her heart race. She took the first bite. For a moment, the world around her disappeared. The flavors were deep, warm, and comforting all at once. It was spicy but balanced, rich but not heavy. Every bite felt like a story unfolding. Amara had tasted hundreds of dishes in her life, but nothing had ever come close to this. Her eyes slowly lifted to look at Kofi. "How did you make this?" she asked softly. Kofi only smiled. "A good meal," he said quietly, "is made with patience and a few secrets." Those words stayed in Amara's mind long after she left the stall that night. Over the next few days, she kept returning to Kofi's stall. Each time he served something new: smoky grilled fish with herbs, creamy peanut stew, soft bread filled with fragrant spices. And each dish tasted even better than the last. Soon, people in the market started noticing Amara sitting at the same stall every evening. "Careful," one old woman joked one day. "If you keep eating his food like that, you might end up marrying the chef." Everyone laughed. Everyone except Amara. Because the thought didn't sound strange to her at all. In fact, the more she thought about it, the more it made sense. Amara loved food more than anything. And Kofi created the most incredible food she had ever tasted. What kind of life would it be, she wondered, to wake up every morning to meals like this? Weeks passed, and Amara and Kofi began talking more. At first it was just about ingredients, spices, and cooking techniques. But slowly their conversations grew longer. Kofi spoke about his travels, the places he had learned different recipes, and the people who had taught him the art of cooking. Still, there was always something about him that remained hidden. Sometimes, late at night when the market had grown quiet and the lanterns flickered in the wind, Amara noticed Kofi staring into the pot as if he were thinking about something far away. Other times, when she asked about certain ingredients, he would pause, then gently change the subject. But Amara didn't think much about it. All she could think about was the food. One evening, as the sun dipped below the trees and the sky turned deep orange, Amara made a decision that surprised even herself. She looked at Kofi and smiled. "You know," she said, half laughing, "I think I could spend the rest of my life eating your cooking." Kofi looked at her quietly. For a moment he said nothing. Then he asked a question that made the air feel suddenly heavier. And if you discovered how my food is truly made, would you still say the same thing? Amara blinked in confusion. What do you mean? Kofi simply stirred the pot again, the steam rising between them like a curtain hiding something unseen. Amara laughed it off. To her, food was food and delicious food meant happiness. Soon enough, the two grew even closer, and before long the entire village was talking about their unexpected love story. A foodie who decided to marry a chef, simply because his food was too good to resist. But what Amara didn't know, what no one in the village truly knew, was that Kofi's most important ingredient was something he had never told anyone about. And the day Amara finally discovered the truth behind those unforgettable flavors, it would change everything. At first, the village treated the news like a sweet little rumor. People smiled whenever they saw Amara sitting beside Kofi's stall, tasting whatever new dish he had prepared that day. Some teased her gently, saying she had finally found the one thing she loved more than traveling for food. Others simply shook their heads and laughed. But soon the rumor became something real. One warm afternoon, while the market buzzed with voices and the clatter of cooking pots, Kofi quietly told Amara that he wanted to marry her. He said it in the same calm tone he used while cooking, as if it was the most natural thing in the world. Amara felt her heart race. For someone who had spent most of her life moving from place to place, the idea of settling down had never seemed possible. Yet somehow, standing beside the stall filled with rich aromas and warm steam, it suddenly felt right. Of course, the villagers had plenty to say about it. "You're marrying him for his cooking," one woman joked. Amara laughed, but deep down she knew there was truth in it. Food had always guided her life. Every road she walked had been chosen because someone somewhere promised a meal worth tasting. And now, the best food she had ever tasted belonged to one man. Why wouldn't she stay? The wedding was simple but joyful. Lanterns hung from tree branches, drums echoed through the night, and long wooden tables were filled with steaming plates of Kofi's cooking. People came from nearby villages just to taste the dishes served that evening. There was spicy rice with herbs, roasted vegetables glazed with honey, thick stews filled with tender meat, and soft bread that melted in the mouth. The guests kept praising the food, and Amara watched proudly as Kofi moved calmly between the pots and fires. Yet even during the celebration, a few quiet whispers floated through the crowd. Some villagers said Kofi's cooking was almost too good. Others wondered how he always managed to find ingredients that were so fresh and unique, even when certain foods were difficult to get in the area. But most people ignored those thoughts. Good food had a way of making people stop asking questions. After the wedding, Amara moved into Kofi's home at the edge of the village. It was a modest house made of clay and wood, surrounded by tall trees and a small garden where herbs grew in neat rows. The air there always smelled faintly of spices. For the first few days, Amara felt like she was living in a dream. Every morning she woke to the sound of Kofi grinding spices or chopping vegetables. Every evening the kitchen filled with warm steam and rich aromas. She tasted dishes she had never even imagined before. But slowly little things began to catch her attention. Kofi often woke up before sunrise and left the house quietly. By the time Amara woke, he would already be back carrying a covered basket. Whenever she asked what he had gone to collect so early, he would smile and say it was just ingredients from the forest. One day she tried to peek into the basket. Kofi gently closed the lid before she could see inside. "Some surprises are better left for the cooking pot," he said with a soft laugh. Amara smiled too, but something about the moment stayed in her mind. Then there was the small wooden shed behind the house. It stood a short distance away from the kitchen, half hidden behind thick bushes. Amara noticed that Kofi kept it locked most of the time. Sometimes late at night he would walk there alone carrying a lantern. The first time she asked about it, he answered quickly. "Just storage," he said. "Old tools and supplies." But his tone had changed slightly. It was subtle, but Amara felt it. Still, she tried not to think too much about it. Instead, she focused on learning from him. As someone who loved food deeply, Amara was excited to finally understand how these incredible dishes were made. She watched Kofi cook, memorizing the way he mixed spices and controlled the heat of the fire. Yet there was always a moment when he would stop her. Whenever the dish reached its final stage, Kofi would ask her to step outside or fetch water from the well. By the time she returned, the meal would be ready. At first she thought it was just coincidence. But after it happened again and again, she started to notice the pattern. One evening, as the sky darkened and crickets chirped in the grass, Amara decided to ask directly. "Kofi," she said while watching him prepare another pot of stew, "why don't you ever let me see the final step?" Kofi paused for just a second. Then he stirred the pot slowly. "Every cook has a small secret," he replied. Amara laughed lightly. But I'm your wife now. Shouldn't I know it too? Kofi looked at her with a calm expression that was hard to read. Maybe one day, he said quietly. That answer should have satisfied her. But instead, it made the question grow even larger in her mind. Over the next few weeks, the strange details continued to build. Sometimes Amara noticed unfamiliar ingredients on the kitchen table that she had never seen in the market. Other times she caught a faint smell coming from the locked shed behind the house, a smell she couldn't quite recognize. It wasn't unpleasant, just unusual. Then one evening, while Kofi was out gathering ingredients again, a sudden storm rolled across the village. Strong winds shook the trees and thunder rumbled in the distance. Amara rushed outside to secure anything that might blow away. That was when she noticed something strange. The door to the wooden shed behind the house was slightly open. The wind must have loosened the lock. For a moment, Amara simply stood there, staring at the dark doorway while rain began to fall softly around her. Her heart beat faster. She knew she should probably leave it alone. But curiosity had always been part of who she was. It was the same curiosity that had led her across villages searching for new flavors and hidden recipes. Slowly she stepped closer to the shed. The door creaked gently as the wind pushed it wider. Inside, the lantern hanging from the wall swayed slightly, casting long shadows across the floor. And as Amara leaned forward to look inside, she suddenly realized that what was stored in that shed was not what she had expected at all. Amara stood at the doorway of the shed while the wind pushed rain across the yard. The lantern inside swayed slowly, making the shadows on the wooden walls stretch and shrink like they were alive. For a moment she hesitated. Her heart beat faster, and a quiet voice in her mind told her to simply close the door and go back inside the house. But curiosity had always been stronger than fear for her. She stepped inside. The shed was larger than it looked from the outside. Shelves lined the walls, filled with jars, baskets, and bundles wrapped carefully in cloth. Some held dried herbs she recognized from Kofi's cooking. Others contained strange roots and leaves she had never seen before. Amara moved closer to one of the shelves. Each jar was neatly labeled with small handwritten notes. Some names were familiar spices used in African cooking: ginger, cloves, dried peppers. But other labels looked unusual. The handwriting was careful, almost secretive. She leaned closer to read them. Forest blend. Night spice. Deep flavor mix. The names were strange but not frightening. Still, they didn't explain why Kofi kept them hidden away in a locked shed instead of the kitchen. A sudden gust of wind slammed the door behind her. Amara jumped slightly and turned around. For a second she thought about leaving immediately. But then something else caught her eye. At the far end of the shed stood a small wooden table. On it rested a covered clay pot and several folded pieces of paper. The papers looked old, the edges slightly worn, like they had been handled many times. Amara slowly walked toward the table, her footsteps soft on the wooden floor. She picked up the first piece of paper. It was a recipe. Not like the simple ones Amara had seen before. This one was detailed, filled with notes written in the margins. Measurements were carefully listed, along with cooking times and instructions. Whoever had written it had spent years perfecting it. Amara flipped to another page. Then another. Dozens of recipes were stacked there, each one more complicated than the last. Some included ingredients gathered from deep forests, rivers, and distant villages. It was clear that Kofi had built an entire collection of cooking knowledge. For a moment, Amara felt impressed. This must have been the source of his amazing food. Years of recipes, experiments, and secret techniques. No wonder his cooking tasted so unique. But as she continued flipping through the pages, she noticed something that made her pause. Some ingredients appeared again and again. They had strange names she didn't recognize. Not herbs. Not spices. Not vegetables. Just unfamiliar words written in careful handwriting. Amara frowned slightly. Maybe they were rare ingredients from places she had never visited before. After all, Kofi had traveled much more than she had. It made sense that he knew things she didn't. Still, a small feeling of unease crept into her thoughts. She placed the papers back on the table and lifted the lid of the clay pot beside them. Inside were small cloth pouches tied with thin string. Each pouch carried the same strange scent she had noticed near the shed before. It wasn't unpleasant, but it was strong and earthy, like something taken from deep in the forest after rain. Amara carefully picked up one pouch and held it close. "What are you doing in here?" The voice came from the doorway. Amara's heart nearly jumped out of her chest. She turned quickly and saw Kofi standing there, rain dripping from his shoulders. The lantern light reflected in his eyes, but his expression was calm, almost too calm. The door was open, Amara said quickly. The storm must have loosened it. Kofi stepped inside and closed the door behind him. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Amara held the pouch in her hand, unsure whether to put it down or explain herself further. I was just curious, she added softly. I wanted to understand more about your cooking. Kofi looked around the shed slowly as if checking that everything was still in place. Then his eyes returned to the pouch in her hand. That room is not part of the kitchen, he said quietly. His tone wasn't angry, but it carried a firmness Amara hadn't heard before. She quickly placed the pouch back in the pot. I didn't mean to invade your space, she said. I just thought, since we're married now, maybe I could learn your recipes. Kofi walked toward the table and gently placed the lid back on the clay pot. Some recipes take years to understand, he said. Amara forced a small smile. I have time. Kofi didn't answer immediately. Instead, he gathered the papers from the table and tied them together with a piece of string. Not everything needs to be rushed, he said after a moment. The conversation ended there. They returned to the house, and Kofi began preparing dinner like nothing unusual had happened. Soon the familiar smell of spices filled the kitchen again. But that night, as Amara tasted the stew placed in front of her, something felt different. The flavor was still rich and comforting. It was still delicious just like every meal Kofi cooked. Yet now, every bite carried a question. What exactly made his food taste this way? And why did he keep those ingredients hidden? Over the next few days, Amara tried to forget the strange moment in the shed. She told herself that every chef had secret recipes. Maybe Kofi simply wanted to protect the knowledge he had spent years collecting. But the mystery refused to fade. In the market, villagers continued praising Kofi's cooking more than ever. Travelers came from far away after hearing stories about the chef with unforgettable dishes. Some even said his meals had a way of making people feel unusually happy and satisfied. Amara heard those words many times. And each time she remembered the jars in the shed, the strange ingredient names, and the pouch she had held in her hand. Late one evening, while Kofi was outside preparing the cooking fire, Amara stood alone in the kitchen. Her eyes slowly moved toward the back window. From there, she could just barely see the small shed behind the house. The door was locked again. But this time, Amara noticed something she hadn't seen before. A thin trail of smoke rising gently from the small chimney on its roof. Which meant that at some point during the night, Kofi had been using that shed again. And whatever he was doing in there, he was still keeping it completely hidden from her. From that night on, Amara could not look at the shed the same way again. Before, it had simply been a small building behind the house. Now it felt like a locked box holding answers she wasn't allowed to see. Every time she stepped into the yard, her eyes drifted toward it without thinking. Life in the village continued as usual. The market stayed busy, people laughed and bargained over vegetables, and Kofi's food stall remained the most crowded place every evening. Travelers still arrived hoping to taste the famous cooking they had heard about in nearby towns. And every single day the compliments followed. This chef has magic in his hands. I've never tasted food like this. Whatever his secret ingredient is, it must be something special. Whenever Amara heard those words, she forced a smile. But inside, the curiosity kept growing. At home, Kofi behaved the same as always, calm, patient, and focused on cooking. He treated Amara kindly, sharing stories from his travels and teaching her small parts of his cooking process. She learned how to prepare herbs, how to grind spices the right way, and how to control the fire so food cooked slowly and evenly. But the final step of every dish was still kept away from her. Every time the cooking reached that stage, Kofi would gently send her outside. Could you bring water from the well? Can you check the bread in the clay oven? Would you mind picking fresh herbs from the garden? At first Amara obeyed without question. But after discovering the shed, each request began to feel less like coincidence and more like a careful routine. One evening she decided to test something. As Kofi stirred a large pot of stew over the fire, the rich smell of spices filled the kitchen. Amara stood beside him, pretending to focus on chopping vegetables. Soon enough, Kofi glanced at the pot and said calmly, Amara, could you step outside for a moment and bring some wood for the fire? Normally she would have agreed right away. Instead she paused. There's already enough wood here, she said gently. For the first time, Kofi stopped stirring. The silence lasted only a few seconds, but it felt much longer. Then he gave a small smile. Just in case the fire grows weaker. Amara looked at the steady flames under the pot. They were strong, bright, and clearly not dying anytime soon. But she still nodded and stepped outside. When she returned a minute later, the lid was already back on the pot. The stew was finished. That small moment stayed in her mind all night. A few days later, another strange thing happened in the village. An old traveler arrived at the market just before sunset. His clothes were dusty and he carried a small bag over his shoulder. Like many visitors, he walked straight toward Kofi's stall after hearing people praise the chef's famous dishes. Amara happened to be standing nearby when the traveler tasted the food. His reaction was different from the others. Instead of smiling or praising the flavor immediately, the man paused for a long moment. He took another bite slowly, studying the taste. Then he looked directly at Kofi. "This recipe," the traveler said carefully, "where did you learn it?" Kofi wiped his hands on a cloth. "From many places," he replied calmly. The traveler nodded but didn't seem fully convinced. "I've traveled far across many regions," the man continued, "and some of these flavors, they remind me of very old cooking traditions. People nearby didn't pay much attention. They were too busy enjoying their meals." But Amara noticed the brief look that passed between the two men. It lasted only a second. Then Kofi smiled politely and continued serving food like nothing unusual had been said. Later that night, after the market closed and the village quieted down, Amara lay awake in bed listening to the wind moving through the trees. Kofi slept beside her, breathing slowly and peacefully. But her thoughts refused to rest. The shed, the hidden ingredients, the strange recipe names, the traveler's reaction. All the pieces felt connected somehow, but the picture was still incomplete. Then she heard something. A faint creak. Amara turned her head slightly and saw Kofi slowly sitting up from the bed. He moved carefully, trying not to wake her. Amara closed her eyes just enough to pretend she was still asleep. Kofi stood, grabbed his lantern and quietly stepped outside. A minute later, the soft glow of the lantern passed by the window, heading toward the shed. Amara waited. Her heart beat faster with every passing second. Finally, she slipped out of bed and moved quietly to the window. Outside, the yard was dark except for the lantern light near the shed. The door opened slowly and Kofi disappeared inside. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then a faint glow appeared through the small window of the shed. And once again, thin smoke began to rise from the chimney. Amara's curiosity had now grown into something stronger. This was no longer just about secret recipes. Something was clearly happening in that shed during the night. Something Kofi didn't want her to see. She stood at the window thinking carefully. Part of her wanted to trust him and ignore the mystery. But another part, the same adventurous part that had spent years traveling for new flavors and stories, refused to stay quiet. If she truly wanted to understand the chef she had married, she needed answers. Slowly, Amara stepped away from the window and moved toward the door. Outside, the night air was cool and still. Crickets chirped in the grass, and the lantern glow from the shed flickered softly between the trees. Each step across the yard felt louder than it should. The closer she got, the clearer the light inside the shed became. She could hear faint sounds now. The clink of jars. The soft grinding of something against stone. Kofi was working carefully, completely unaware that she was standing just outside the door. Amara's hand slowly reached for the wooden handle. Her heart pounded so loudly she was sure he might hear it. Whatever secret lived inside that shed, she was only one step away from seeing it. And once that door opened, nothing between them would ever be the same again. Amara's fingers rested on the wooden handle of the shed door, but she didn't open it right away. The sounds inside were clearer now. Something was being crushed slowly with a stone grinder. The steady rhythm made it obvious that Kofi was completely focused on his work. Her heart pounded in her chest. For a moment she almost turned back. Maybe she should just return to the house and pretend none of this had happened. Maybe every great chef simply needed privacy to finish their recipes. But then the wind shifted slightly, and a faint smell drifted through the cracks of the door. It was the same earthy scent she had noticed before. Strong, deep, almost sweet, but also unfamiliar. Amara slowly pushed the door open just a little. The lantern light spilled into the yard. Inside, Kofi stood with his back turned, leaning over the wooden table. Jars were open around him, and the stone grinder moved steadily under his hands. He was mixing something carefully, measuring small portions and adding them together like someone following a precise recipe. Amara held her breath and watched. Next to him sat several small bowls filled with dried leaves, ground powders and thin slices of roots. Some looked like herbs she recognized from markets she had visited during her travels. Others looked completely unfamiliar. Kofi finished grinding the mixture and poured it into a small clay bowl. Then he did something that made Amara lean closer. He reached for one of the folded papers on the table, the same recipe she had seen earlier. But this time he flipped past the cooking instructions and turned to the back of the page. The back wasn't a recipe at all. It looked more like notes, observations written in careful lines. Amara couldn't read every word from the doorway, but she caught fragments as the lantern shifted. Flavor reaction. Stronger effect when mixed with stew. Visitors returning for more. Her stomach tightened slightly. Effect. What effect? Kofi scribbled something new onto the page, then carefully placed the paper back into the stack. After that, he took the small clay bowl containing the fresh mixture and sealed it with cloth and string, the same way the pouches in the pot were tied. Amara felt a chill move through her. Those pouches, the ones used in the cooking. Suddenly she understood something she hadn't realized before. These weren't just ingredients. They were prepared mixtures. Special blends that Kofi created separately from the kitchen. The final step of his cooking. Amara's mind raced as she quietly stepped back from the door. But before she could move away completely, another voice spoke from the darkness behind her. So, you finally decided to look. Amara nearly gasped. She turned quickly and saw a figure standing near the trees. It was the old traveler from the market. He stepped forward slowly, the moonlight revealing his face. You shouldn't be out here alone this late, he said calmly. Amara tried to steady her breathing. What are you doing here? The man glanced toward the shed, where Kofi was still working inside, unaware of their presence. I had a feeling you might come looking for answers tonight, the traveler replied. Amara frowned. Answers about what? The man didn't reply immediately. Instead, he studied her carefully as if deciding how much to say. You love food, he finally said. That much is obvious to anyone who watches you in the market. Amara crossed her arms slightly. What does that have to do with anything? The traveler lowered his voice. Have you ever wondered why people become so attached to his cooking? Amara hesitated. Of course she had wondered. But hearing someone else say it made the question feel heavier. Good food makes people happy, she said quietly. The traveler nodded slowly. Yes, but sometimes food can do more than that. Amara felt a cold knot forming in her stomach. What are you trying to say? The man glanced again toward the shed window, where Kofi's shadow moved across the wall. Years ago, the traveler continued softly, I passed through another village where a cook had a similar reputation. People traveled for miles just to taste his meals. They said the flavors were unforgettable. Amara listened carefully. But after a while, the traveler said, the villagers noticed something strange. What? People who ate there kept coming back. Again and again. Not just because the food tasted good, but because they felt like they needed it. Amara felt her pulse quicken. That sounds ridiculous, she said, though her voice was less confident now. The traveler gave a small shrug. Maybe it was. But when I tasted Kofi's cooking earlier today, some of the flavors felt very familiar. A sudden movement inside the shed made both of them freeze. Kofi had finished tying the pouch and was now placing it inside the clay pot with the others. The traveler leaned closer to Amara. I'm not saying your husband is doing anything dangerous, he whispered. But I do know one thing. Amara looked at him. There are ingredients in this world that do more than change taste, he said quietly. Some affect the way people feel, the way they think, even the way they crave certain things. Amara's heart pounded louder. Her thoughts rushed back through every moment since she first tasted Kofi's food in the market. The way it had made the whole world disappear. The way people kept praising it. The way travelers returned again and again. And the notes she had seen on the back of those recipes. Effect, stronger effect, visitors returning. Before she could say anything else, the shed door suddenly creaked open. Kofi stepped outside holding the lantern. The warm light spread across the yard. And in that moment he saw them. Amara standing near the door. The traveler beside her. For the first time since she had known him, Kofi didn't look calm. He looked surprised. His eyes moved slowly from Amara, to the traveler, and then back to the half-open shed door behind them. The lantern flame flickered in the night air. And the silence between the three of them suddenly felt heavier than any secret Amara had discovered so far. The lantern in Kofi's hand trembled slightly as he looked at Amara and the old traveler standing beside the shed. For a long moment no one spoke. The wind moved softly through the trees, and the thin smoke from the chimney drifted into the night sky. Amara felt her heart beating loudly in her chest. Everything she had been wondering about for weeks was now standing right in front of her. The shed, the secret mixtures, the hidden recipes, none of it could stay hidden anymore. Kofi, she finally said, her voice steady but filled with questions, What are you making in there? Kofi looked at her carefully. His calm expression had returned, but his eyes showed that he understood something important had changed. Instead of answering right away, he turned his gaze toward the traveler. So, Kofi said quietly, you decided to stay longer than expected. The old traveler folded his arms. I was curious, he replied. Your cooking reminded me of something I once saw many years ago. Kofi sighed softly as if he had been expecting this moment. Then he walked toward the shed door and pushed it open wider. If you're both this curious, he said, then you might as well come inside. Amara hesitated for a second but then followed him. The traveler stepped in behind her. The lantern light filled the shed again, revealing the jars, herbs, and carefully tied pouches on the table. Kofi set the lantern down. These are not poisons, he said calmly, as if responding to an accusation that had not yet been spoken. And they are not meant to harm anyone. Amara looked around the room. Then what are they? Kofi picked up one of the small cloth pouches and held it in his hand. These, he said, are flavor blends I learned to make during my travels. Some come from deep forests, some from mountain villages, and some from cooks who spent their entire lives perfecting them. The traveler stepped closer. That still doesn't explain the notes on your recipes, he said. The ones about people returning. Kofi's eyes met his. Yes, he replied quietly. Because food is not only about taste. He paused before continuing. When someone eats something truly comforting, something that reminds them of warmth, home, and happiness, they want to feel that again. Amara listened carefully. I spent years learning how ingredients affect more than just flavor, Kofi continued. Certain herbs relax the body. Some roots sharpen the appetite. Others bring a sense of calm. The traveler frowned slightly. So you're saying you mix them to make people enjoy the food more? Kofi nodded slowly. Exactly. Amara felt a mixture of relief and confusion. So the secret ingredient isn't something dangerous? No, Kofi said gently. It's simply knowledge. Understanding how flavors and natural herbs work together. He walked to the shelves and pointed to the jars. These are things people have used in cooking for centuries. I only studied them carefully. The traveler looked around the room again, clearly surprised. So there's no trick? He asked. Kofi smiled faintly. The trick, he said, is patience. Amara let out a long breath she didn't realize she had been holding. For weeks she had imagined something far more mysterious hiding inside this shed. Instead, it was simply a place where Kofi prepared his special blends before finishing his dishes. But why hide it from me? She asked. Kofi looked at her with a softer expression. Because every cook guards their final step, he said. It's the heart of their craft. The tension in the room slowly faded. The traveler nodded, clearly satisfied with the explanation. I suppose I misjudged the situation, the old man admitted. Kofi gave a small shrug. It happens. After a moment, the traveler stepped toward the door. Well, he said with a smile, I should probably continue my journey tomorrow. But I must admit, your cooking truly is unforgettable. He walked out into the night, leaving Amara and Kofi alone in the shed. For a while, neither of them spoke. Finally, Amara laughed softly. All this mystery, she said, and it turns out you were just protecting your cooking secrets. Kofi smiled back at her. Some secrets keep the magic alive. They returned to the house together, the cool night air now feeling calm instead of tense. Amara felt lighter knowing there was no dark mystery behind the meals she loved so much. But the story didn't end there. The next morning, the traveler prepared to leave the village. He packed his small bag and walked toward the road just as the market began to wake up. Before leaving, he stopped once more at Kofi's stall. Kofi handed him a warm bowl of stew for the journey. The traveler tasted it slowly. Then he leaned closer and lowered his voice. You explained the herbs, he said quietly. But there's still something you didn't mention. Kofi looked at him calmly. What do you mean? The traveler smiled slightly. I've tasted those herbs before, he said. They're good, but they're not strong enough to create flavors like this. Kofi didn't respond. The traveler set the bowl down and continued walking toward the road. But before he disappeared, he called out one last sentence over his shoulder. You're right about one thing, chef, he said. The real secret is knowledge. He paused. And I wonder, where you truly learned yours. Back at the stall, Kofi stood quietly for a moment. Then he lifted the lid of the large pot, stirring the rich stew slowly as the familiar aroma filled the morning air. Nearby villagers gathered eagerly, ready for another taste of the famous cooking. And as the steam rose into the sky, Kofi allowed himself a small, mysterious smile, one that suggested there might still be one secret ingredient he had never revealed to anyone. The morning after the traveler left, the village slowly returned to its usual rhythm. The market filled with voices again, baskets of vegetables were placed on wooden tables, and the smell of cooking fires drifted through the air. At the center of it all stood Kofi's stall, just like every other day, surrounded by people waiting for a bowl of his famous food. Amara stood beside him, watching the crowd with new eyes. For weeks she had been chasing a mystery. The shed, the hidden ingredients, the late-night work, the strange notes on the recipes. Now that she knew the truth, everything felt different. The fear she once felt had turned into curiosity again, this time in a calmer, more thoughtful way. She watched Kofi prepare the stew, the same careful movements she had seen many times before. Grinding spices, tasting the broth, adjusting the fire beneath the pot. Every action carried patience. "You never get tired of this, do you?" Amara asked softly. Kofi glanced at her and smiled. "Cooking is not just work," he said. "For me it's a story." Amara raised an eyebrow. "A story?" "Yes," he replied. "Every dish carries the memory of where it came from. The people who taught it. The places it traveled." Amara thought about that as she helped serve bowls to customers. The villagers were laughing and chatting, praising the food like they always did. Travelers stopped to ask where the famous chef was. Some people even took extra portions to carry home. The old traveler's words still echoed quietly in the back of her mind. "I wonder where you truly learned yours." For a moment she studied Kofi again. "You traveled a lot before coming here," she said. Kofi nodded. "More than I ever did." She hesitated, then added, "But the traveler seemed to think you learned something unusual along the way." Kofi placed another bowl on the counter before answering. "People often imagine mysteries where there are none." "That's not really an answer," Amara said with a small smile. Kofi chuckled. "You're right," he admitted. "But the truth is much simpler than people expect." The lunch crowd slowly faded as the sun moved higher in the sky. When the market quieted down, Kofi finally sat beside Amara on a wooden bench behind the stall. "You remember the first day you tasted my stew?" he asked. Amara laughed softly. "Of course. I thought it was the best thing I'd ever eaten." Kofi nodded. "And what did you feel?" Amara thought for a moment. "Warm," she said. "Comfortable. Like everything around me slowed down." "That's the real secret," Kofi replied. Amara looked at him curiously. "Food becomes unforgettable when it connects to something deeper," he explained. "A memory, a feeling, a moment of peace." He pointed toward the busy market. "Most cooks chase flavor alone. But flavor is only one part of the experience." Amara slowly understood what he meant. "You mean the atmosphere, the smell, the feeling of being here?" "Yes," Kofi said. "When people gather, laugh, and share a meal together, the food becomes stronger in their memory." Amara looked around the market again. Families were sitting under shaded trees, friends were sharing bowls, and travelers were listening to village stories. It wasn't just the food they were enjoying. It was the moment. "So the herbs and spices," she said. "They help," Kofi admitted. "But they're not magic." He paused before adding, "The real ingredient is care." Amara smiled at that. Over the next few weeks, she began helping Kofi more often at the stall. Not just serving food but learning the cooking process step by step. He still protected some of his special blends, but he slowly trusted her with more knowledge. Sometimes they worked together late into the evening, experimenting with new recipes and flavors. Other times they simply sat outside the house, sharing stories about the villages Amara had visited during her travels. The small shed behind the house was no longer a place of mystery. Now it was simply part of Kofi's craft. Amara even helped organize the jars and herbs on the shelves, learning the names of ingredients she had never heard of before. One evening, while they were preparing a new spice blend together, Amara suddenly remembered something. "That traveler," she said. "Do you think we'll ever see him again?" Kofi tied a cloth around a pouch of herbs and shrugged. Travelers rarely stay in one place for long. But he seemed to know a lot about cooking traditions. Kofi smiled slightly. "There are many people in the world who understand food deeply." Amara studied his expression. "You still didn't answer his question, though." "Which one?" "Where you truly learned everything." Kofi looked out toward the trees for a moment before answering. "I learned from many people," he said. "Old cooks in quiet villages. Street vendors in crowded towns. Farmers who knew the land better than anyone." He paused. And sometimes, from mistakes. Amara laughed softly. That sounds more honest. Cooking teaches humility, he said. Every dish can improve. The sun slowly dipped toward the horizon, painting the sky with warm colors. The evening market began to come alive again as people returned for dinner. Soon the familiar smell of Kofi's cooking filled the air once more. Amara watched the crowd gather around the stall, smiling as she handed bowls to waiting customers. For the first time she realized something important. She had started this journey because she loved food. But now she understood that food was more than taste. It was connection. It brought strangers together, turned small villages into welcoming places, and created memories that lasted long after the last bite. Later that night, after the market closed and the village grew quiet, Amara and Kofi walked back toward their home. The lantern light from the shed glowed softly in the yard. Amara looked at it and smiled. You know, she said, if I hadn't been so curious, I might never have learned any of this. Kofi laughed. Curiosity is a good quality for a foodie. Amara nudged him playfully. Well, I did marry a chef because of food. And do you regret it? Kofi asked. Amara looked up at the stars for a moment. Then she shook her head. No, she said warmly. Now I finally understand the real flavor behind your cooking. And as the quiet night wrapped around the small house at the edge of the village, the smell of spices and herbs drifted gently through the air, reminding anyone nearby that sometimes the most unforgettable stories begin with something as simple as a single bowl of good food.